Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm well, thank you, and I hope you are too.
Good, thank you.
This week has been an amazing week for a number of reasons, but mainly not because, for me, not so much because of the news, but because of publications that I finally got around to looking at, though not read properly yet, but because I see what they are talking about and that they have a very interesting approach to modern problems, and the problems that they're dealing with are basically the same problems that we talk about every week, that have to do with social change in the modern world, the fact that it's happening faster and faster, and that it's completely changing the human condition in the modern, insofar as we're on a stage, on a progress from the past that we know a fair amount about into the future that we know nothing about, and trying to work out what the possible scenarios for the future are. And they involve pessimism about our problems of dealing with these problems, and also a lot of optimism that make it look very interesting. Anyway, I'll start with the first one that I came across, which has an interesting title, which is Weapons of Math Destruction, math as in mathematics. Obviously, the title is a very clever way of reminding us of the problems of the last few decades of weapons of mass destruction, but looking at something very different, which nobody really, some people are aware of, but nobody has any idea of how problematic they may be. And that is the sort of thing that has affected the outcomes of elections in a number of countries in recent years. And the fact, which is related to the fact that there is so much more information available to us these days, but our ability to handle all this information is way behind. And in fact, the way information is handled is basically in terms of algorithms that oversimplify everything. And the case that this woman makes, Cathy O'Neill, who wrote the book, is that the algorithms all involve some sort of bias, which benefits some people and not others. And so, and I thought this was extremely interesting because I've always thought that the reason that we are having to deal now with two outcomes of national voting, one in the Brexit referendum in England and one the recent presidential election in the United States, is that a lot of people who are doing the voting are voting according to some of the information that's available, but not all of it.
And what is her proposition?
She doesn't have an answer to this. She thinks she's explaining the source of the problem, which is how to deal with the amazing increase in the amount of information that is available readily to everybody who looks for it. But there's essentially no technologies available that organize the information in a way that makes it possible for everybody to benefit from it.
Does she, excuse me for interrupting you, but does she deal at all with, when we say information, I'm putting quote marks around information. Does she do any research into validating that information as to whether it's true or false or propaganda? Or...
That's the problem. We don't know whether it's true or false. And that's part of the problem of lack of technologies for handling it.
Okay.
Anyway, I have to admit that I've not read the book yet. I've only recently come across it and skimmed through it. and I can see that it's something I should spend some time, much more time on than I've been able to so far. And the other thing that I came across is much more, what shall I say, comprehensive, and in fact far more pages, and it's by a man called Yuval Noah Harari, who is an Oxford history PhD who teaches in Israel, and he's written now 3 books, all of 400 or 500 pages at least, and the first one has been translated into numerous languages, and it is called *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is called *Homo Deus: A Brief History of the Future*. And the third one, which has only just come out, I think, and I've certainly not seen it yet, is called *21 Lessons for the 21st Century*. And he's applying the methods of a historian to the way human abilities have become global, and have what they have achieved up to the present, and what the possible scenarios are for the future. And in the third book, I think, although I've not seen it yet, but if you just Google him, you'll find very interesting interviews on the web about what he's thinking, is just exactly what the current problems for the future are. It really is quite amazing that books like this should have come out at this time, and should have been so successful. I say everybody's reading them, and I haven't read them yet, but they are bestsellers. I think 1 or 2 of them have been on the New York Times bestseller list, and been translated into many languages.
But by the title of his first 2 books, it certainly appears that he's trying to cover the waterfront, as they say. And I guess when he talks about the 21 questions for the 21st century, do you have any inkling as to maybe what some of those questions are?
Well, obviously they have to do with the relationships between different parts of the world, as they all struggle, as we've said several times in our weekly discussions, that every part of the world is at a different stage of social change, and but he introduces much more interesting elements into this discussion than I think we had thought of, which is that there's not only are there different stages of social change, but they are thinking differently about their own achievements in the past. And so, for example, Americans think that they've always been successful and always been the best country in the world. And China thinks that it's always been taken advantage of, well, for several centuries now, it's been taken advantage of, and has to somehow get even with the rest of the world. And this makes a big difference.
That's a very interesting observation, because there is in fact a collective national memory perception that countries have. How did we overlook that?
Yeah. And India, of course, though I've not seen what he says about India yet, but India, the Indians who never had a national consciousness before the 20th century are becoming aware of the fact that they've contributed so much to global civilization that they didn't know about.
Right.
And are trying to redefine their position in the world. And this is happening in other places as well. And it makes an enormous difference to the way different parts of the world interact with each other now in the present.
You know, wouldn't it be interesting if you could somehow get the right people of the top 20 major countries together, political, cultural, religious, scholastic, business, put them all in a room for 6 months, and go through and the respective histories of each country, and come out with a agreed to statement that this is what we all collectively recognize these countries have historically contributed to the world as it exists today, and then all of a sudden everybody could almost start with a clean slate and be proud of their own background. It's I mean, it's a little crazy, but I see where he's going. I mean, if everybody didn't have a memory axe to grind, so to speak, things would be a lot different.
The United Nations should do things like this,
Yeah.
but unfortunately, the United Nations doesn't do things like this, partly because of a similar problem of the way it's organized and the problems of reorganizing it in a more constructive way.
Mm-hmm.
That is, everybody's going to resist any form of reorganization that might put some countries at a disadvantage.
Yeah, even though it might actually substantially come to the advantage of those same countries that are worried. I mean, if you just take Pakistan, for example, that might be worried about being put at a disadvantage. And I would say, look, I mean, you're a country that was formed relatively recently, 50 or 40 years ago. I mean, you've been able to organize yourself in one way, shape, or form. You have nuclear weapons. I mean, you're a valuable partner to the West, and then alternately sometimes to the Chinese. I mean, you've become a little bit of an economic powerhouse. You've been largely able to maintain internal peace. You've been able to scare and intimidate a neighbor to your east who's like 10 times your size. I mean, take a breath, you guys. I mean, you're doing all right. I mean, relax. You don't have to worry.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the most, if we should say something about the news this week, and the most interesting thing that's happened in the news this week is this, what started with an escalation of problems between India and Pakistan, which in fact has been handled in a positive way.
Yes, a lot of it due to that Indian fighter pilot, I might add.
Yeah. And one of the things that Harari draws attention to is the way that battles, have decreased in incidents. That is, the world has actually become more peaceful in recent history. But I haven't read enough of the book yet to know how he relates to that observation.
Well, I'm gonna have to find these books. It's interesting because I just picked up a book last night written by John Meacham, who's an American historian. He writes out of Vanderbilt University down in Nashville, and the title of the book is something called "Our Better Angels." Taken from Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, and it's a contemporary book. He talks about the problems going on in the United States now, the divisiveness here, the Trump presidency, etc., and then goes through 6 or 7 historical examples in the history of the United States when things were even worse. Talking about the better angels, as Lincoln said in the first address. Surely our better angels will address the situation, and we'll all be fraternal and brothers and sisters again. So it's a book of optimism. I'm reading it right now.
Yeah, well, one of the things that Harari makes a lot of is the fact that all the problems that we had to rely on God to solve a century ago, we can solve ourselves now.
Well, that's good. We can give God a break.
Okay, so
well, I'm gonna learn more about these 2 books, especially the Harari book, and we'll maybe talk a little bit more next week about this if you're agreeable.
Yes, certainly. Yeah.
All right, Professor Spooner, have a very good week. Thank you.
And the same to you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.